Hello everybody, this is Professor D with the Course Creator, and we are going to be talking about some heavy stuff today. So I am going to warn you, like what we are going to be talking about is going to be heavy. But after this, we're going to start looking about what we can do to use and own our power. So just hang in here with me because we want to get a sense of like the scope of the problem and get our hands around the problem and then see what we can do to affect the problem. Now that we have a better sense of what it is and how it works. So today we're going to be talking about systemic oppression. And then when we talk about like intersectionality, like we want to like look at the intersectional oppression of people with different oppressed identities. So remember that if we're Mexican, woman, poor, and lesbian, because this person has more identities that are oppressed, their oppression because of that identity is greater because they're getting stuff on them from all different types of people in all different types of spaces. And that's where stuff really becomes overwhelming and daunting. And it really just frankly becomes almost too much for people to overcome at some point. So with that, let's watch this video talking about understanding oppression and unpacking the different levels of oppression and how oppression works in this levels of oppression video.
Just as all counselors need to know something about how to help people to heal, how to help people to grow and develop, and how to help people get free from unnecessary limitations, all counselors should know something about how to help people overcome oppression. So this is a crash course in Oppression 101 for counselors. Oppression is a social system in which some groups of people are systematically disadvantaged, mistreated, and often treated as less than fully human, while other groups of people benefit from a kind of disproportionate unearned advantage at the cost of the disadvantaged groups. It's a social power structure in which much of your life experience is determined by the social identities that you belong to. So, for instance, if you are a person of race or a person of gender, which race and which gender will determine the kinds of sources of support that you automatically benefit from and the kinds of sources of stress that you automatically will have to deal with. There's a kind of equation that people sometimes use to explain oppression in brief, and it goes, oppression equals prejudice plus power. Now, to explain what that means, I want to explain something about these three different components of oppression, and then I'll come back to the question of power. So one component of oppression is that often people experience prejudice. Prejudice refers to a kind of set of feelings that I might have about an entire group of people and any member of that group. So let's say the group that we're talking about is Steves. And maybe I feel uneasy around Steves. Or maybe I feel guilty around Steves because I think Steves think that I'm oppressive. Or maybe I just have kind of a aesthetic feeling about Steves where I don't like being around them as much because they're kind of unfamiliar and alien to me. That's a feeling of prejudice. I might also think Steves are the best ever, sort of love prejudice, like people have often for their own children, just because they're their children. Prejudice is about the feelings that you have about a group of people. A second component of oppression is stereotypes. Stereotypes are a set of beliefs that you have about a group of people that then get applied sort of indiscriminately to every member of that group. So if I think that Steves are all really smart, or that Steves are all bad drivers, or that Steves smell bad, or that Steves are not the kind of people that I could trust with my children, those are stereotypes about Steves that I will just apply to all Steves. It's a kind of belief, it's cognitive, it occurs in the mind, whereas prejudice occurs in feelings. A third component of oppression is discrimination. If I treat all Steves in a particular way, that's discriminatory. I treat people in a particular way just because they're Steves. Like maybe I leave them out. I don't want to invite Steves into my club or to my event. I don't think that Steves should be around. So I'm sort of exclusive towards Steves. Or maybe I look down on Steves, or I say kinds of demeaning things to Steves. That's discrimination because I'm acting on it. It occurs in behavior. So prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination occur in feelings, thoughts, and behavior. And they're these three different components of oppression. Now, none of them by themselves is oppression per se. Because unless they're backed by a societal system of power, then they don't form oppression. So, for instance, there are phrases like reverse sexism and reverse racism that people use that don't really make sense. Reverse sexism doesn't make sense because we don't have a wide network of men's shelters where men need to go to get away from the physical or sexual abuse that they receive from women and from their wives. We don't have a long history of solely female presidents, such that boys growing up in the world have a sense like, how could they be president? There have never been any male presidents before. The system of power is asymmetrical, moves in one direction. And so when you put power behind prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination, then what you've got is oppression. Now, oppression actually also occurs on three levels. So to really understand that, we have to talk about the three different levels of oppression in addition to the three components of oppression. The first level of oppression is that there's a kind of structural oppression, or what's often called institutional or institutionalized oppression. So if we take an oppression like heterosexism, for instance, which discriminates against people who are not heterosexual, who are gay and lesbian and bisexual, and queer or trans in some other way, then an example of institutionalized oppression is the notion that marriage is between a man and a woman. This is a law. It's a law and legislation that limits the rights of a particular group of people. So it's built into an institutional structure. And there are lots of these institutions like the legal system and the prison system and law enforcement. But institutionalized oppression also occurs through institutions that inform people of things, and in this case, misinform people about groups of people. So like the media or the school system or religious institutions are all ways that people learn about the world. And if people are systematically misinformed about what particular groups of people are like by those institutions, that's a form of institutionalized oppression. The second level of oppression is interpersonal or individual oppression. This occurs on a much smaller scale in institutions. So if we take heterosexism again, we can imagine an example where a young person comes out to their parents, and the parents judge them or maybe even disown them. That's a form of interpersonal oppression. We all grow up experiencing interpersonal oppression on a very sort of close one-on-one scale and in small groups. And so we are trained into particular roles. If you are in a group that is the target of oppression, you will learn to play the victim role, where because you have been victimized in your past, you learn to feel powerless and act powerlessly. If you are in a group that is the agent of a particular form of oppression, you learn to play the oppressor role, and you'll be set up to be an oppressor toward people in other groups. So part of what happens at the level of interpersonal oppression is we learn to play these oppressor and victim roles that are both dehumanizing for everybody who's caught up in the system. A third level of oppression is internalized oppression. And again, coming back to heterosexism, if someone who is gay or queer in some way feels like they don't belong, that's internalized oppression. The external oppression marginalizes people. It says you don't belong, you don't fit in. If you belong to a group that's been marginalized and you start to feel like you don't fit in, maybe you don't even feel like you belong to the community of queer people, then that's internalized oppression. Internalized oppression has a huge role to play in the perpetuation of oppression, and it's talked about the least of all of these three levels, but it's essential to understand what internalized oppression is. Now, okay, so you understand something about what oppression is and how oppression works, but why is this important in counseling? Well, I want to say a few of the goals of the work of overcoming oppression in counseling, now that you understand something about how oppression works on a large scale. The first is that we want to help people reclaim power. Part of being in the victim role means that we're robbed of a sense of power, and so we don't have a sense of how much we can impact the world and change the world around us to become more how we'd like it to be. The work of reclaiming power is the work of stepping outside the victim role. A second goal is we want to help people learn to become allies. Learning to become an ally is a way of stepping outside the oppressor role. It's a way of saying, I want to make it my business to understand what it's like for people in different groups to grow up under the effects of oppression, and learn to be allies in helping those people overcome the internalized oppression and helping them reclaim their power so they can work to stop the oppression and to create change in the world. So becoming an ally is the second goal. And the third goal has to do with social identity development. In all of the social identity groups that you belong to, like gender and race and age and sexual orientation and religious background and ethnic background and class background and more, in each of those, you can develop your identity more than it is now, which means that you may not know that much about what it's like for people in your own group. And coming to understand that means that you start to realize how much you have actually been affected by oppression that you may not realize. It also means that you come to realize that things that you've always thought were about you are not personal at all. There are ways that people in your group tend to get treated, and so they've affected you personally, but they're not personal to you. And this means a lot of the things that we think of as just individual problems turn out not to be. Like, if you've been disempowered your entire life, you can become depressed, because that's one of the effects of not having a sense of your own power to make the world that you want it to be. If you've been alienated your entire life and excluded, well, then you can feel this kind of alienation or lack of belonging in the world. If you have been in a group that is subject to violence or threats of violence, then you may feel a kind of anxiety that just gets built into your experience of the world and mistrust of people. But they're not personal. Those are effects of oppression. Only by understanding oppression and how it works, only by coming to develop our experience of our social identities, are we able to do the work of overcoming oppression as counselors and for ourselves and one another. I'll talk a lot more about oppression in a future series of videos. This is your crash course, Oppression 101 Intro.
I felt like that was really good. Sorry I got a little windy at the end there, but there's not a lot of videos about oppression and like how it affects people and how it affects their worldview and how they kind of carry this sense of like trauma with them in different spaces that we go. But I felt like it was really important. One, because it would help you understand what's happening to you with your oppressed identities and where you might be carrying stress, or you may feel like overwhelmed, or where you don't have the ability to do anything, or you're feeling so disempowered and disenfranchised that you can't even move. So I wanted you to see and be able to understand that concept, but then also I wanted you to be able to understand like this for other people, because it's so easy for us to just be like, well, you know, I know you're poor, but like, get a job somewhere and like you can pull yourself up and you can work your way forward. Like, but if they don't feel or believe that that's possible, it's hard to begin. And you have to feel connected, and you have to feel as though people feel like heard and connected enough before they're going to believe in you enough to actually like go forward with what they want you to do. Like, you have to like feel heard, you have to feel seen, your experience needs to be validated in all those different ways. Otherwise, you're not going to believe that this person knows you, knows your situation, knows your experience enough to create the trust in you to use that trust to move forward. So with this, I tell you that because like sometimes when we're going to try to help with people, like I am your professor. I believe everybody in this class has the ability and the capacity to complete this course, as well as if they give the proper effort, get the degree they're hoping to see at the level of where you want to be and where you want to go. Like, what I need to help you with is making sure that you push hard enough to get to the place that you have to go, because all of you have the capacity, but it's that consistent effort and following through. But I also have to recognize that you're having trouble making rent. We're in a pandemic. There's a recession going on. Some people might be getting kicked out of their houses. So I have to make accommodations for those things, understanding that you all suffer from oppression in a different way. If I'm going to help you get to the place that you got to go, that trust building is critical as far as what we need to understand with other people if we're really going to be good competent intercultural communicators. So again, let's check this video out so we have a better sense of what oppression looks like and how oppression works.
Think of a baby when it's born as a simple stick figure. Pretend identity is like the first set of clothes given to them by others who expect them to wear that style throughout their life. Now consider their personal style, like the color or hairstyle. I suppose that they would pick the best match to their personality. Likewise, gender identity is shaped at birth when a doctor assigns gender. Grandparents then begin to describe boys as having strong cries or give girls pink headbands with bows. For some, gender assignment and all that is associated with it is without conflict. As we mature, we carry this assigned identity as we engage with social structures like schools. Cisgender kids go into their assigned boys or girls bathroom without hesitation. Walking into a different bathroom is next redirection. For transgender and genderqueer people, however, the assignment of gender at birth is equal. Their identities create tensions and are in opposition to assigned gender roles, behaviors, and expectations from friends, family, and society. They worry which bathroom is safe for me. This tension also happens around language. In the U.S., English is considered a primary or sole language, and this affects everyone's identity. And unless you're in a foreign language class or a bilingual school, there can be stigma about speaking languages other than English in the classroom or in the playground. You may receive messages that English is the only acceptable language in school. The social messaging is that speaking another language is shameful and problematic, while speaking English, ideally without an accent, is rewarded as good behavior. In this way, Spanish-speaking family members are stigmatized as others, and speaking Spanish becomes undesirable. This process explains why, regardless of country of origin, children of non-English speakers lose their language by the third generation. These are just a couple examples that demonstrate how social structures construct, limit, and place value on identities. This becomes highly problematic when school completion, racial profiling, poverty, and health disparities are associated with specific identities. Social messages from schools, peers, and the media are conflicting. They tell us that all men are created equal despite what is actually reinforced by everyday interactions, like the classic example of a white woman guards a person in an elevator when a black man enters. A clash begins when the social messaging and the actual experiences do not match. We cannot be equal if we define one group as better or even superior to another based on gender or racial identification. Whiteness is the preferred norm, the identity that all other identities are compared to or contrasted against. The norm of whiteness is so strong that it is invisible. For instance, when describing a person, if their race is not described, the assumption is that they are white. Inequality touches all parts of our lives, even when we're thinking of starting a healthy family. We assume that education, income, and healthy lifestyle should produce the same healthy birth outcomes regardless of race in the U.S. Yet research indicates that regardless of age, education, income, and healthy behaviors, and unrelated to genetics, black women in the U.S. have poorer birth outcomes than their white counterparts. Black women experience increased infant deaths, maternal deaths, and low birth rates. Many scientists associate the resulting poorer birth outcomes with increased stress related to experiences of racism. But how do we have social change and inequity when those who are most affected can be demoralized and frustrated by our everyday attempts to achieve the same outcomes as their white counterparts? Our relationship to identity roots can be the key to creating change. Since social inequities occur predominantly to communities of color, social transformation requires, among other things, a mobilization of identity. Social movements based on identity, such as the Black Liberation Movement, the Chicano Movement, and the Women's Rights Movement, harness identity by educating people about social structural inequality and its impact on them. In this way, social movements can create an educated counter-narrative. Stories like that of Benjamin Banneker, a black architect who was hired by Thomas Jefferson to build the White House after the French architect Pierre-Charles L'Enfant turned off the job. This exemplifies Banneker's invisibility in U.S. history and the prominence of L'Enfant, who has a metro-stop named after him in Washington, D.C. Knowing that invisible history and cultural icons of communities can be used to coalesce people of a shared identity, and can call forth other successful historical struggles. For instance, the United Farm Workers Union and their leaders, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, carried banners of Our Lady of Guadalupe using March from Delano to Sacramento, California to demand justice for farm workers. The same icon was used by Father Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico's fight for independence from Spain, and again in the Mexican Revolution by Emiliano Zapata. The way that these icons were used are also evidence that global and national struggles for transformational change can be organized at local levels. As people committed to social change, the questions for us are, how much do we really understand about the history and legacies of the communities in which we work? And, as both insiders and outsiders of these communities, how do we use the power of narrative informed by cultural histories of contribution, resistance, and injustice to activate change in grassroots community organizing?
So I felt like that video was excellent. I loved that that video existed. I loved being able to reference that for y'all because it kind of tells you about, again, how we're taught over time to think in a certain way, to make certain assumptions in certain ways. And it's hard because those assumptions inherently leave people out. And we want to understand that oppression happens on all different levels. People are oppressed with their individual identity, right? So if I'm a black person and I'm attempting to navigate the world, I might get followed, or I might get left out of a group assignment, or I might be, people might say little weird things to me where I don't feel connected. Like they might try to speak Ebonics to me, or like if a white person wants to try to be my friend but then calls me the N-word. Like, this is a form of oppression, right? Because now I'm being left out. I'm not making the connections that I need to make in order to feel a sense of belonging in the environment. At a group level, you can see certain people are included in certain areas, that are considered in certain areas, and then are not considered in other areas as well, right? The long fight for Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter being recognized as a legitimate request for validation and a recognition of there is an issue with police brutality. I'm not saying all police are bad, but there's a lot of videos of like black people getting killed, and that's a problem, and we should look into it. That's really like Black Lives Matter's issue. But the fact that they're seen as a terrorist organization, or that a whole organization like Blue Lives Matter sprung up just to counter this like idea, gives you a sense of how this group is excluded or marginalized, and they attempt to hijack this story, hijack the narrative to be about something different, right? While police do have difficult jobs, it is a job, and you don't have to work that job. You can choose not to, be employed in that area, but you can't choose to not be black. And you can't choose to just opt out of potentially being the subject of police brutality, right? So understanding that is really important as well. In an institutional space, you can see that if you've ever seen the documentary 13th, 13th is available streaming on YouTube for free. It's about an hour and a half, but it talks about how we use the criminal justice system as a form of modern day slavery due to the fact that we really don't pay people in prison for their work, right? So institutionally within the criminal justice system, 1 out of every 3 black men end up in the criminal justice system. Now, black people make up 1 out of 17 people in the American population. So institutionally, black people are way overrepresented in the criminal justice system. But this leads to systemic issues, right? Because I don't know if you've ever heard the idea in the black community of where are the fathers. It's like almost like a passive blame put on male figures in the family. Well, when you have a criminal justice system that finds a way to lock up 1 out of every 3 black men, you can see something's happening there. Because, there's just no way, those folks are fairly criminalized in this area. I think they're unfairly targeted. And to give you a sense of how this unfairly targeted works is that with crime, when police are looking for crime, what they do is they go to places where crime has been high before. So if you're going to a place to look for crime where crime's been high before, you're going to find crime in the place that you look for it because you're only looking for it in places where there had been high crime before. And so say we're going to go look for drugs, right? Well, traditionally they look for drugs in communities of color, and then they arrest people of communities of color. However, statistically, we know that white, more affluent neighborhoods tend to abuse drugs, not street drugs, but they abuse prescription drugs that are not their prescription drugs at a higher rate. So if they really wanted to stop drugs and the problem of drugs, they would police white affluent neighborhoods more often because statistically we know that drug abuse is happening at a higher rate there, right? We see it in movies and TV shows like, hey, do you want a Xanax? Like, that's breaking the law. You can't just give someone prescription medication because they're like somewhat sleepy today, right? But that's an example of like how this system works to keep certain people oppressed. And so I've got another video to help you with the system of oppression, to give you a sense of what it is and how it works. And I feel like this will give you a sense of how this system happens, gets reinforced, and retaught.
In this video, I'm going to discuss the oppression framework and the cycle of socialization presented in Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. The oppression framework was developed by Rita Hardin and David Jackson. This framework discusses how oppression functions and who is responsible for oppressing whom.
The basis of this framework is the concept of social groups.
A group is a group of people who share particular characteristics within a category. So, for example, within the category of gender, people who share the characteristic of identifying as female would be women. Here are some more examples. Social identity categories of race, for example, being broken down into particular social groups of particular races, such as multiracial, Latino, Black, White, Asian. Now, social groups are not neutral. The membership in these groups has particular status, a sense of power, and an impression in society of how powerful this group is in relationship to other groups. However, the status is not innate. It's not because of the group itself. The status is socially constructed. We build this as a society. Now, oppression is the system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on the stereotypes of social group memberships. So it's a system that maintains advantage for members of a male social group, or members of a white social group, or members of a Protestant Christian social group, or a wealthy social group. Now, oppression operates on multiple levels. It can be individual, it can be institutional, and it can be cultural. Individual would be conducted by a person, institutional by an organization or a system, and then cultural would be by cultural practices that aren't necessarily regulated by an institution. Now, oppression can be intentional, meaning it's done on purpose, but it can also be unintentional. Much of oppression happens subconsciously, accidentally. No one means to oppress anybody, it just happens. Oppression can also operate in multiple dynamics. It can be vertical, up, down. It can be horizontal, side to side, or internalized, in which case it happens within a person. Vertical oppression is when an advantaged group oppresses a targeted group. So in this case, if we have heterosexual people who are harassing and bullying gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer people, that would be vertical oppression. The group with power is directing their oppression at the group without power. Horizontal oppression happens within an advantaged group or within a targeted group. So white parents who tell their white daughter that she cannot date a person of color, that is maintaining an oppressive system within the advantaged group. Targeted to targeted, that would be like a group of poor people calling another group of poor people white trash. That would be in a case of both people are oppressed, but they're oppressing one another, and they're maintaining oppression within their own group. Internalized oppression happens within ourselves. So a wealthy person who goes into a poor neighborhood and feels like I'm too good for this place, I don't want to be here, I'm scared to be here, that's happening within themselves if they're maintaining that system of oppression. Targeted could be someone with a learning disability telling themselves, I'm too stupid, I can't do this. That would be them taking a stereotype and applying it to themselves. So that covers the framework of oppression. I'm now going to move on to the cycle of socialization. And I'm specifically going to focus on racism as the cycle of socialization. The cycle of socialization was developed by Leanne Bell, Barbara J. Love, and Rosemary A. Roberts, also published in Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. The main assumption of the cycle of socialization is that we are not born with oppressive attitudes or beliefs. And so with a focus on race, we are not born with racism. We are not born with any concept of race. Race is entirely a social construction. So at birth, when we haven't yet been exposed to society, we don't yet know anything about racism. However, we develop racist attitudes, values, and beliefs. We become exposed to them and begin to internalize them through socialization. That means interaction with society, interaction with other people. It is by interacting with people that we begin to acquire racist attitudes, values, or beliefs. Now, the socialization is not always obvious, and it's not always on purpose. It's often very subtle. It is often covert as opposed to overt. Overt means obvious, covert means secretive or hidden. This is what the cycle of socialization looks like as a diagram. So as you can see, we are born with no guilt, no blame, no racism at all at birth. But then over time, we begin to learn racist attitudes and values. Like we'll learn from our family, or from our friends, or from teachers, people who love us and care about us. And again, this often is not done on purpose. As a child, when driving through a poor neighborhood, a neighborhood that was primarily people of color, my mother would lock the car doors. And she wasn't trying to teach me racist beliefs, but I started to believe that certain people who looked a certain way were bad people, and that's why we had to lock our doors. This initial learning is then reinforced by social institutions and by our culture. We then accept things that that's just the way it is, we can't change it, and we end up subconsciously teaching these things to other young people, and the cycle continues. The way to break the cycle, though, is to educate ourselves and develop our awareness, and then take action to try and stop this. So some of the institutions that reinforce racism include media, schools, language that would be more cultural than institutional, the judicial system, the economic system, the political system. For example, thinking about the political system, the vast majority of our elected officials are white. So even if, it's completely accidental, perhaps, or not on purpose, we don't require these positions to be held by white people, but the message is conveyed that politicians and people with power look a certain way. They tend to be white, they tend to be male. Our economic system, you notice that most people who are poor are people of color, wealthier people tend to be white. We start to perceive race as having an element of class to it. In terms of language, we tend to unconsciously assign positive values to whiteness, negative values to darkness or blackness. We'll talk about an evil heart is a black heart. We'll talk about purity and goodness as being white. We say a little white lie. When referring to good, we usually talk about light, when referring to evil, or dark. Another thing is we also often say like nude color or flesh color as referring to the color of white skin for Band-Aids or crayons, or the color of pantyhose. In terms of education, you notice that schools with more resources, wealthier schools, can also be whiter schools. There's a sense that we see higher educational achievement levels among white communities rather than communities of color, reinforcing a negative stereotype of the intelligence or the ability of people of color. In terms of media, the vast majority of actors that we see are white. When people of color are portrayed, it's often in a minor role or a stereotypical role. Not always, but often. In cartoons, good characters, heroes, are often have lighter skin than the villains. The villains are often darker. Even in The Lion King, where they are lions, not people, Scar the lion is darker than Simba the hero. In our judicial system, we see that our prisons are filled with people of color. Our prisons are filled with people of color, and black men are more likely to go to prison than to go to college. So all of these systems, rarely on purpose, reinforce racist attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. Now, one of the positive things about the cycle of socialization, though, is that socialization can work both ways. Right now, we have a society that tends to socialize people to unconscious racist attitudes and beliefs. However, through education and awareness and action, it is possible to raise our consciousness and to take steps to transform the system of racism that we find ourselves in. The bad news is that we are socialized with racist attitudes and beliefs. But the good news is that we can conduct anti-racist socialization in order to transform the systemic oppression in our society.
So that gives you a good sense of kind of what this is and how this works. And it also kind of like gives a lot of other examples of how these things happen and how we learn what we see or call normal, or how we learn and what we see or call an expected way of being. Sometimes our problem is we normalize things that don't necessarily need to be normalized in the way that we talk about stuff. And we just need to talk about things slightly differently so we can create more opportunities for folks that are being oppressed. For example, one of the things that are really easy to do is I call my wife my partner, and I call my wife my partner because it normalizes that anybody can have a partner of any gender in their loving relationship, right? It's a very simple way of communicating something slightly different that allows for opportunity for more people, and it doesn't reinforce the notion of like man, woman in marriage, right? So oppression. Let's break that apart. Social oppression exists when one social group, either knowingly or unconsciously, exploits a social group for its own benefit. Now, we got a sense of what this looks like when we did our privilege assignment, and that you get these unearned benefits, and the people that don't have these unearned benefits don't get those benefits. So you get this stuff at the cost of these people that don't get this stuff. And that is a problem because it's a big part of what keeps us apart as people. Like if we could talk to each other, reach out to each other, connect with each other, work on each other's behalf to make the world a better place. Like we could help each other be in a better and more happy space. But the problem is we've been taught to be divided. We've been taught it's an us and them situation. And it's just not, that doesn't have to be that way. What are some factors in oppression? Well, it's very pervasive, meaning it's all over the place. It's restricting, and then it makes you be or act in a certain way. And it also reinforces and rewards people for performing that internalized oppression that we talked about in the last activity, right? So it's restricting in what it asks you to do. It's even restricting for in-group conformity, right? Because it makes people act in a way that holds power for that group. It's hierarchical in that it holds one group at the top at the cost of everybody else that's not in that group. It's very complex in how it connects in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different spaces. Like, you can't just immediately undo oppression, because oppression, as we will see, is a web of several different interconnections that is really difficult. And then also, like I said, with the last time we talked about stuff, oppression is internalized. We do believe the negative messages against ourselves to some degree, and that keeps us down as well as the societal messages that we see, as well as the way we're treated by other people. So this is the web of oppression, and you're going to be doing an assignment based on the web of oppression. Now, oppression works by having all these little threads come together, and it separates people, right? So if you think of this web existing like horizontally, side to side, rather than up and down like the way it is now, it favors the privileged people on the top. So the people above the web would be the privileged people, and then the people below the web would be oppressed people. And all these things come together with a lot of different stories and narratives and things that hold certain people on top and certain people on bottom. So cliches, laws, traditions, beliefs, policies, education, religion, government, assumptions, stories, all these things come together in these ways to oppress people. So let me give you a sense of what it looks like with Native people, because the course creator is Native. So examples of webs of oppression and how they come together with these different areas, right? So there's a lot of jokes about Native people saying how, or using me not go to blah, 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 right? That's an example of broken English, right? So the assumption there is that Native people can't speak English or don't speak English well. Laws. Native people are actually the group that are killed most often by police. Statistically, Native people die at the hands of police because of police brutality, even higher than black folks. But because most reservations are in rural areas, there's less videos being shared about those things because there's less cell phone networks, there's less internet, there's less Wi-Fi, there's less all of these things, so we don't see these things as much. In media, Native people are always seen as Plains Indians. Very rarely do we see Native American folks from the Pacific Northwest, the eastern northeast coast. We don't see Pueblo people. We don't see Dene people, right? A cliche that also like can oppress Native people is like this wooey idea of us being like of medicine men or shaman, right? We're seen as kind of like backwards with healing and some things like that. Traditions like Thanksgiving, right? The actual celebration of Thanksgiving stems from a slaughter of Native people after the first Thanksgiving. So the fact that that's a national holiday definitely shows you how the U.S. feels about Native people. Education, there's very, very few reservations or universities that are available on reservation lands. In Phoenix, we're one of the very, very few places that has one, and that's Scottsdale Community College. It is actually on the Salt River Pima community land, and so that is on community land. They don't call it a reservation, they call it community. Assumptions, like people will come to me and ask me for me to smudge their house because I'm supposed to be spiritual or like have some special connection to like the spirit world. This again creates a sense of distance or disconnection from me and other people. The government's broken a lot of treaties and don't recognize the treaty rights that they signed to and agreed to. And some of those things still haven't been followed up to this day. For example, I think I just saw recently that Native people were supposed to get, like the Cherokee Nation's supposed to get a House representative, but Nancy Pelosi's holding it up and won't seat it. And she's a Democrat. She's supposed to be helping like with this type of stuff, right? Government, there's broken stories. Pocahontas, like the Disney movie Pocahontas, She was actually kidnapped and serially raped by John Smith. By no means was that a love story, but you see in Disney, like, this story becomes a love story because of the Disneyfication of things. Policies like the need that I would have a blood quantum, like a card that proves how much blood I have, as a Native person, is one of those things that I don't have access to. And did you know that Native people, dogs and horses, are the only thing that people track blood and lineage for to prove how much of a thing they are? It's really dehumanizing when you think about it. And then lastly, religion. Indigenous religions are seen as backwards. So you see how this web comes together to privilege non-Native people and oppress Native people specifically through the use of these things like broken English, like laws, like media, right? All these things come together to separate those of the white racial identity and those of Native racial identity. And you could do the same thing with this, with like Black or Mexican, Latinx, Puerto Rican, like whatever. Like, you just have to find different examples for each of these outlying areas. So to understand the power of the web, all social identities that are oppressed deal with this problem. And a lot of times it's very comfortable or very easy to think this is a people out there problem. But as we've learned in this class, we contribute to this web. Then that we have unexamined beliefs and we do unexamined actions, and how we communicate those unexamined beliefs and unexamined actions support the web, because we repeat these stories, we repeat these narratives, we uphold these policies, we vote for these laws. So we are part of the problem in that we're not doing something to rip the web apart. So you can't be neutral in areas of privilege or oppression, because to be neutral or attempt to do nothing means that you passively allow the web of oppression to exist by not attacking it. The only way that you can be not complicit or not neutral is to attempt to attack the web and attempt to decommunicate or disincentivize or disempower the web through our actions. We have to intentionally change our communication on behalf of others to rip this web apart. But how do we begin to do so? So I'm going to give you an example of what I want you to attempt to do with this challenging the web of oppression story, right? So here's things that you could do potentially, like I can do as a Native person, but when non-Native people do this, it's so much more powerful, right? So with jokes, don't allow people to joke about Native people with broken English. For media, maybe I can choose to consume movies from Native directors like Spoke Signals or Skins or Powwow Highway. I also could, traditions, right? At Thanksgiving dinner, like talk to people about the truth of Thanksgiving and maybe take a moment to honor Native people, honor the land that you're on, and honor the sacrifice of Native people rather than just pretending Pilgrims and Native people got along. The more we know real histories, the easier it is for people to get along, even when that history is uncomfortable. Education, make friends with Native folks in your classes, help them and be a resource available for them to complete their education, be a support system, reach out to Native people, be friends with Native people. Check your assumptions, ask questions with a curious heart about Native culture, and then share what you've learned about Native culture with other people. Another thing you can do is learn stories about Native leaders and share them with other people. So learning more about Geronimo or Sitting Bull or John Trudeau or Russell Means, all amazing folks. And I can tell you from somebody that's not been raised in Native culture, you're going to become a better person by hearing these stories too, right? With policies, you can tell others not to ask Native people about their blood quantum because it can really hurt Indigenous people, because like it's basically asking whatever are you? How much of a woman are you? How much of a man are you? I'm sure your gender and your gender performance has been called into question by somebody, and you know how much that hurts because we did that activity. And then with religion, we can learn about people's Indigenous beliefs and realize that we are all descended from some tribe of some people in some way, some space, some form, right? So this is an example of what the assignment I'm going to ask you to do with challenging the web of oppression. Now, I am going to warn you that when you really understand how complex the web is and how hard it is to make a difference for somebody, it's going to feel incredibly defeating. Because again, we look at this web and we're like, gosh, there's so many things here. It's so pervasive. It's really everywhere. How can I do anything about this web? How can I make a difference with the web? Right? Like when you look at this, you're like, well, what can one person do? And some people, what they'll say is they'll go like, oh, I could vote for stuff. Like, well, voting for stuff is nice, but like, what are you going to do between every 2 to 4 years to make a difference for people that are oppressed? And it's realizing that we have the power to do something about it, right? Like when I can challenge policies, when I can challenge laws, when I can learn more about other people's religions, when I can understand how the government's treated people over a period of time, I slowly have the power to rip the web apart. And every time I whip the web apart, I make a hole in that web. And if you think about people as flies, the bigger the hole I can make with the way I communicate, with the action I take on behalf of other people, with the friends that I make, with the relationships I make with other people, the weaker the web gets. What's hard, though, is the web's probably always going to be there. Because one person can't fix it, but we can damage it, right? And here's the other thing that's hard, is unconsciously, and I'll tell you this because I do this too, unconsciously sometimes when we're not really thinking or being critical, we tie the web back together with assumptions again. We tie the web back together with like notions of meritocracy. Like as your professor, I find it really hard to like instill the discipline in you that I feel like you need to have in order to be successful someday. And also understand that like life is really hard on you based on your social identities. Like that delicate balance rips me apart over and over again all the time. But the more I can make holes in that web, the more of you make it through. The more of you get those jobs. The more of you become the first in your family to get a degree. And the more of a difference that I can make one person at a time, the more you make differences for people one people at a time. And I'm going to share this story with you because I feel like it's very appropriate when we're looking at taking on something so overwhelming. So an old man was walking on the beach one day after a storm. And in the distance, he saw somebody like moving, and it looks like they were moving like a dancer, right? When they saw it, they saw that it was a young girl picking up starfish and throwing them in the ocean. The old man says, young lady, why are you throwing the starfish in the ocean? And the young girl says, the sun is up and the tide is going out. And if I do not throw them in, they will die. But young lady, young girl, don't you recognize how many miles of beach there are? And how many thousands of starfish are out here? There's no way you could possibly make a difference. There's no way you could make a difference. And the young woman listened to him very politely. Then she bent down, picked up another starfish, and chucked it into the ocean. And she says, I made a difference for that one. And that's where I believe it starts. It's the personal decision to see an issue and attempt to make a difference. Because are you going to save them all? No. But you can save some, and you can help some. And here's the thing. Think about the impact that young girl had on the old man. Like he may have saw her choosing to make a difference, and he may choose to make a difference too. And it's us communicating these new thoughts, these new ideas, these new ways of being that creates the opportunity that I'm looking to see from you. So with that, I am going to ask you in the Take on the Power of the Web to recognize that it can feel overwhelming to try to cope with the web. That we always need to be in an ongoing process of checking ourselves, how we're communicating, what we're supporting, what we're believing in, so we don't unconsciously support this web of oppression that keeps us apart. We need to recognize that we have the power to make a difference for one person. Or for many people, with the small communicative acts that we make every day, with the stories that we choose to promote or the stories we choose to subvert. We have the power to do something on behalf of people that really need it very badly every day. The problem is society has taught you you don't have power, that you can't make a difference, and that is a lie. Because we have the power to keep the system in place, which means we have the power to undo the system that's in place, and we have the power to make a difference. And I want you to remember the power of that starfish story. Like, it may feel like you'll never make a difference and it'll never feel like you made a dent. But every starfish you get into the ocean makes a difference. It dramatically changes the experience in the life of one person. Because life ain't nothing but a whole bunch of drops in the bucket. Are you adding your drops in that bucket? And over time, everybody adding drops in the bucket creates an ocean of change. And that's what I'm hoping to see from you. So thank you for listening to Systems of Oppression and Understanding the Web of Oppression. Know that in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about power, how we can see power, how we can use power, and how we can use the power of communication to start making a difference on behalf of people who've been exploited and oppressed for a long period of time. And this is how we begin to move into being that competent intercultural communicator that makes a difference on behalf of other people, that creates opportunities of connection and belonging with other people, and begins to undo the power of this difficult web that exists in front of us. With that, thank you very much. This is Professor D, your course creator. All blessings to you.